everyone, and welcome to another edition of the IMI Talking Leadership podcast. 5 years on from the start of the pandemic, and I feel like I've said that a few times in recent weeks, everyone needs to be a hybrid manager, but very few people have actually had training in what that means and how to be an effective leader in a hybrid world. My guest today is John Dore. He is a thought leader in the field of organizational leadership, and he challenges audiences to transform their thinking about leadership and create cohesion as an organizational advantage. John is also the author of the book Glue, and we'll talk about that whole concept a little bit later. But for now, John, go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, thanks, Farah. Thanks for inviting me. No, it's a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, I've sort of spent the past 20 years working with leaders and managers, literally thousands of managers from hundreds of different organizations from dozens of different countries around the world. And the sort of culmination of that is the last few years, I've been running some leadership programs supporting very senior leaders at London Business School. So that's what I do as a day job. Away from that, I get involved in some other things, mainly around, again, team effectiveness and performance.
Thanks very much, John. So, a lot of the debate at the moment is about the mode of work. So, should it be full-time office, full-time remote, hybrid, how many hybrid days, all of those different discussions. But I think you have a slightly different opinion on the hybrid work conundrum. You think it's more about the way that leaders actually lead. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think nearly all the debate has been about the mode. If you follow the business press or the sort of commentary, it's often about, should it be remote? Should it be hybrid? Should it be 2 days in the office, 3 days in the office? The sort of mechanics, the sort of details of something. And essentially the genie is already out of the bottle. In sort of 2020, we transitioned very rapidly. I think in Ireland at one point, 40% of all employees in Ireland were working remotely. It's sort of a little less than that now, but hybrid is the sort of fixed form now. I don't think hybrid's going to go away. I think the issue is that you put it quite nicely at the beginning, though. It's sort of there was no training manual issued in 2020. We didn't all get a manual with sort of this is how to transition to be a hybrid leader. And being a hybrid leader used to be quite rare. They were international managers. They might manage teams around the world on video conferencing and might visit them in the field once or twice a year. We sort of expect everybody to be a hybrid manager and to have the right skills, mindset, and behaviors to be successful, not just to manage people within the office, but in a different context, not necessarily with you. And sometimes, for some progressive organizations, not even necessarily in the same country. So the nature of leadership has changed. Just to say that on that far, I sort of mentioned I work with a business school. A lot of the models we teach in business school and a lot of the methods and best practice we describe, it's sort of borne out the experience of leaders in the last century and the beginning of this century, in an analog world, in a pre-iPhone world. Whereas if you think about it now, we've transitioned so much in the past 10 or 15 years to a digital world and now a digitally enabled hybrid world. So to expect leadership to remain the same is probably not going to work. I think we need a different form of leadership.
So, John, if it's all about how someone leads as opposed to the mode of work, do you think there's any merit in letting each team member or each department decide what mode of work is best for them? For example, you'll get some people who might want to do full-time office-based work. You'll get some people who prefer full-time remote because that fits in better with the rest of their lives or where they want to be based. And you'll get some people who prefer to come in once or twice a week, get those water cooler chats, but still be able to have the freedom to pick up their kids from school or whatever it might be. Do you think there's any merit in allowing everyone to do what they think works best for them?
Yeah, there's a few things there. I mean, there's quite a long laundry list. I mean, essentially, there's quite a good evidence that individual productivity increases, better work-life balance, better well-being. Certainly, if you have childcare responsibilities or care responsibilities, hybrid work and flexible work is obviously, hugely beneficial to the individual. I think the debate that hasn't quite been had is what that sort of means organizationally, collectively, collaboratively. So I do think there's a discussion to be had within teams. I know within Ireland, it's sort of, 2023, there was legislation passed saying that it's an entitlement and a right anyway for individuals to request flexibility. So I don't think, as I said before, that genie is going to go back in the bottle. I think it's there. But I think a healthy discussion about okay, you can be wonderfully productive individually, but how do we get the best out of you with others? I've described it elsewhere as, being apart has never been more popular, but there's some really good evidence that actually being together and being collaborative and being connected and being creative together actually creates quite beneficial outcomes, not just for the individual, but for the organization.
Thanks very much, John. Before we move on to some of the topics around hybrid work and connections, I want to talk about something else that's probably just as popular, if not more so, than hybrid work in 2025, and that is AI. You mentioned during your lunch and learn session that you did for us at IMI that AI is either going to destroy the world or save the world, depending on who you speak to. Why do you think that could be the case?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think it's always best to sort of look at, where you can go for good information on these topics. So I'm quite fond of a few people I'll mention. On the dystopian view, the danger view, the destroy the world view, it's worth checking out this gentleman, Eric Schmidt. He was the CEO of Google for a number of years, and he's sort of been relatively vocal in the last sort of 12, 18 months on the dangers of AI, a sort of dystopian view that we become even more disconnected, misinformed, and he sees there's dangers there with bad actors and rogue states and all sorts of things. So, and in fact, some of the things he's talked about are so scary. YouTube even took down some of the things he said, which I thought was, slightly worrying. And then there's another view. The Jamie Dimon in the US is the CEO of JP Morgan. He said that it's actually going to save us. So this struggle we've all had for a decade or more now of how do we get organizations to be more productive, the productivity benefits of just being able to instantaneously access information and communicate clearly and accurately with one another might actually be a big beneficial boost for organizations and for teams. So that's one view. I prefer the middle view, and the gentleman I recommend your members check out is a gentleman called Peter Hinson. He's a technologist. He's a guest lecturer at MIT in the US and also at London Business School, and he runs a thing called NextWorks, and they sort of coordinate these two opposite views and come up with a synthesis, I think, of what's probably more likely to happen. So Peter's worth checking out, but I do think it's worth having your eye on the horizon and having what's next, I think, is really important. I don't think AI is going to. I mean, I just forgive me, Clara. I've spent the last 48 hours creating an action figure of me in a box and a Muppet version of me, which my wife found hilarious. So AI in a way could end up just being a distraction and another here's Siri idea, but it could actually have more fundamental effect. But I think there's an onus on all of us to find out. To find out.
Thanks very much, John. Speaking of action figures, ChatGPT could not get mine right. As many times as I tried, it made me look like a kind of 1950s lady, which is fine in certain ways, but not what I was looking for. So I have my doubts about the action figures. But
But
anyway,
somebody made a really good point to me there. There's been such a boost on ChatGPT with action figures and Muppet creation that the actual data centers and server farms that channel ChatGPT are having to be throttled because suddenly the world all wants to be an action figure. Now, if that's technology progress, I'm all for it, really.
it's interesting because we always see these trends with AI. So something that everyone jumps on, like the action figure, but you don't necessarily see all of the other uses that AI can have. And one person called out a question during your session, which we didn't get to. So I'll pose it to you now. You mentioned self-checkout machines at one point, and that's kind of a case where there's a machine, it's doing a job, but a human still needs to be there to kind of facilitate that task at some points. And someone asked, is there potential for AI to just be essentially a fancier version of the automated checkout machine, insofar as that it needs to be served by humans, its output processed by humans, and can it threaten the connections that we have?
Definitely, absolutely, definitely. So it already does. So if you go on a customer experience website, you've had a problem with a supply or something, you're more than likely going to be put through a chat bot, which is probably AI generated. It's going to, if you want to do any of those queries. So you're being what I call disintermediated. You're being taken away from connection with a human being, and you have to intermediate with a machine. So I think that's already there. The automatic tech checkout thing, the thing that worried me about that was the nature of the job the human being was doing. The person there was serving the machine, was fixing them, helping the machine, advising the machine, which is a completely different way of the way we've sort of thought about machines. And then I think the third thing on AI is we're already disintermediated by technology. I asked my nephew the other day to make a phone call. He couldn't use he doesn't know. Of course, he knows how to use a phone, but he doesn't want to ring somebody. He just wants to use a text or a WhatsApp to connect with people. We connect on Zoom or Teams, so there's usually always now in our dealings with other people the intermediation of a device or a machine or a screen or some other form. So we've lost some of that personal contact. Now where that leads cumulatively over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I don't know. I do worry that if you marry that intermediation of machine with a trend where people want to be more apart, that really does worry me. I mean, as you know, I wrote a book about this. It's that's the biggest worry. There was something similar happened in the States at the end of the last century, and it was hugely, hugely disruptive. If that happens in the world of modern work, I think it could be potentially very damaging.
I know that employee engagement has actually fallen a lot since its high point in kind of 2018. Do you think that that has anything to do with how disconnected we are from each other? And how can leaders fix those falling levels of employee engagement within their organization?
Yeah, so I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? So we've given away all these goodies of hybrid and flexible working, and lots of employers are a lot more progressive about all sorts of the ways they support employees now with healthcare benefits and a greater sense of sort of benevolence in the way employers work. But people aren't any happier than they were, and I think that's because attitudes to work have changed. I think there's something gone on. I mean, rather terrifyingly, sort of cost of living increases has generally outpaced um, pay rises in the UK, Ireland, and Europe for over a decade now. So the upside of reward doesn't necessarily feel there. I think being apart and being separated probably has stopped some of the connected, collaborated, esprit de corps aspects of work that's there. And then I think thirdly, work itself is tough. If people work, or a manager, doing things, it's hard work. There's a beautiful line from a colleague of mine, Gary Hamill, very, very, very smart guy. He says, um, he's talking about flexible and hybrid work, and he's saying, is it a benefit? He says, well, a crappy job online is still a crappy job. The fact that you don't have to go to the office doesn't change it. So I think the onus is on organizations to make jobs more interesting, jobs more fulfilling, and work more purposeful, rather than to worry so necessarily about the engagement score. And I don't think this is the other thing I think it's really important, Farah, just for your members on here. Organizations don't do this, and I don't mean they don't try. I mean, organization, individual leaders and managers do it. So what we found is when you see these organizations where the engagement scores actually fallen over time, there's still what somebody calls hotspots. And that's the interesting thing. You see these places where the organization's average has declined, but you can still find departments and functions and bits of the business where people really are deeply engaged. And the common denominator isn't the benefit system or the office or the payroll or whatever. It's usually the quality of manager and leader they work for. That makes the biggest single engagement difference.
I think that's so interesting. And I'm just kind of picturing that myself in organizations that I've been in the past. And I think everyone listening to this can probably take a couple of seconds to try to imagine that scenario in their current job or in a previous company and to just think of which teams are the most engaged and kind of how that relates to the leaders in those different teams. I think that's really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think, wouldn't it be great if you had more mobility and you could go and work there for a few days and find out what's
Yeah.
going on and work out the secret sauce? That would be great if you could do that. I mean, but often we're in our own departments or silos, and this sort of nirvana over there is hard to get. But there is some good evidence that, those leaders, when they move, they take that ability to engage with them. They leave a legacy of an engaged team, but they can take an engaged team with them.
Thanks very much, John. It's really something to think about for everyone who's listening to this today. I want to move on to the next topic now, which is social capital. And that's something that you mentioned during your session with us, and I thought it was really interesting. So I'd love if you could tell our listeners a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. I mean, it's the single, most important thing I think leaders should think about today. If you're a manager or leader, what are you doing to create social capital within your team, your business, or your department? It's called social capital because it comes from sociology. There was a French sociologist called Dore came up with the phrase, and there was an American academic called Robert D. Putnam who wrote a massive tome on social capital in the US. So there's a sort of like intellectual or an academic basis for it, but most of it, most of us know it intuitively anyway. It's the people rubbing along together. It's the collaboration and connection. It's something called reciprocity, which is a lovely word, which is where you do things and there's a benefit that comes back that's not to do with pay or reward, but it's to do with the sort of friendship and support and encouragement you get within teams. Now, there was a very smart gentleman called Samantha Ghoshal, who was a teacher at London Business School. He wrote a piece called The Organizational Advantage, and it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of work where he argues if you take two teams, one with a big degree of social capital and one with less, over time, the team which has the better connections, the better collaboration, and the better relationships is likely to outperform the other. So it's not about money or capital or resources or people or headcount. It's about the connection and the collaboration of that particular team. Now, if that's true for any of us, whenever we want to try and do more as an organization or as a manager, we never get the resources we want. We never get the headcount we want. We never get the capital we want to spend. But what Ghoshal argues is that over time, the connection and collaboration you can create will outperform those resources anyway, which I think is extraordinary. I've known it for 20 years as being called glue, but in formal academic terms, it's often referred to as social capital. And I think it's more important than human capital. So it's not about, lots of individuals, it's about the social capital you can create amongst them. And it's more important than financial capital, which goes like this. But if you can create that cohesion, you can create amazing outcomes.
So, John, you mentioned glue there, and I know that's the name of your book. And if anyone is watching this on YouTube, they can see your book behind you there in your background. So, tell us what glue stands for and what it means.
Well, essentially, it's about that idea of social capital and the importance. It's also about the sort of changing nature of leadership, and just my observation over the last 20 years of working in this space, that the demands on leaders are enormous now. If you've got a responsibility for managing other people, it's a huge responsibility. And the way I describe it is you've probably got like 100 plates to spin. You've got all these hundreds of plates you have to spin. And it's really hard to work out what's most important or what's most impactful. And the reason I wrote the book is I think that's changed. I think sort of the onus on leaders has changed to do some different things. So the glue idea is a very simple model, which is if we're all disconnected and disaggregated and working different places, you've really got to work harder to galvanize people. And you do that in unusual ways. And one of the unusual ways you do it isn't by doing lots of town halls and lots of broadcasts and sending lots of Teams messages and lots of emails. You do it by giving yourself the ability to listen more often and listen more attentively. And then people find that engaging. They find you more engaging. They find the process of working with you more engaging, and you become unusual as a leader. So that was the glue model. I mean, that was the idea that was sort of proposed, and then it's got filled with about 40 or 50 different organizations and stories where leaders have exhibited these glue creating behaviors and then some of the surprising outcomes they've created.
Thanks very much, John. So, there are a few things within that glue idea that leaders listening to this today can go away straight off and start doing, especially that idea of listening and galvanizing. So, thanks very much. I think there's some really practical tips there. I have a couple more questions that were left over from your session, and we did promise people that we would answer these. So let's get into them. The
Okay.
first one is that we're in a hybrid environment now. You even mentioned Teams calls, broadcasts, Zoom meetings, all sorts of things. And sometimes leaders can struggle to balance camera on versus camera off for these meetings, especially when you have larger groups. What do you think is the best approach there? Do you think that the default should be cameras on all the time, and why, I guess?
Okay, so Farah, you and I go to a team meeting together. There's 7 or 8 people in the room together, and 2 people at the end of the room are wearing a paper bag on their head and have muted themselves. They're gagged, and they're in the meeting. And they have to go through this same process where they have to wave their hand to you and ask for permission to speak within the meeting, but you don't know who they are and you can't hear them. Now, if we did that in the real world, if we did that in the analog world, we'd all think it was crazy. But in a hybrid working world, we've normalized that. We've normalized muting people. We've normalized anonymizing them. I think if people are in the room, people should be in the room, whether it's virtual or whether it's in person. They should be in the room. Not everybody's fond of him. One of the books behind me here is Jacobson's biography of Elon Musk, and Musk sort of talks in there about if you're in a meeting and you haven't got any purposeful contribution to make, use your time elsewhere, leave the meeting, go and be productive elsewhere, get back to work elsewhere. So if you're in the meeting, I think everybody's got to be engaged, got to have a purpose to be there, got to be able to see one another's eyes, if nothing else. So I do think it's there. Could I give you one other hybrid working tip? Because I think it's really, really important, and I think it's probably one of the most profound things someone suggested to me. So if you're a manager or a leader, you probably don't go to the office all your time anyway. You probably go 2 or 3 times a week, and maybe sometimes less. Here's a great tip for you. Someone shared this with me, and I think it's really powerful. If you are in the office, don't book a meeting room all day and do Zoom calls or Teams calls. Don't even go in an office all day and do your own work. Sit in open plan, be noisy, be on the phone, have conversations with people, be visible as a human being at work. And better still, don't book out 7 hours of meetings when you are in the office. Have that time for spontaneity, for listening, for wandering around. You can fill your diary when you're back away from the office. But there's something really essential about leaders being seen to be accessible, open, and human rather than, part of this process of work that we've impinged upon ourselves.
It's great to hear you say that, John, because I think we are all guilty of coming into the office once or twice a week and booking that entire day full of meetings, whether we're sitting in our little office room on Zoom all day or whether we're kind of running between one meeting room and the next. So I think it's great
I
to
just
kind of have that idea
quickly on
of,
that, Farah, just quickly on that. I mean, there's
yeah,
a story in the book. This gentleman, Jeremy Darroch, is worth checking out. He was the CEO of Sky. So at one time, he was the highest paid person in Britain. He earned a salary that none of us would ever. But he learned some really good habits, and that walking around and being accessible and listening. He sort of built into, he, forgive me, his PA or his executive assistant built it into his diary, but that had a profound effect upon the way he managed the organization. And some of the things they did, including their global brand Believe in Better, came out from a process of just listening to people and being around and being aware. People know you work hard, they know you work hard because you're the CEO of the firm. But, just those little bits of humanity can have a huge impact.
it's a great perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. We'll end off with one question just about rewards, which we haven't touched on yet. So, how do you think that additional work can be recognized or rewarded without it being just a monetary incentive? And this is also one that we have left over from your session with us.
Yeah, I mean, I have a huge bias on this because I've spent 20 years working in learning and development training and helping people, I think that's the thing. I think organizations find it hard to reward in the right way, but I think they're also unimaginative on development. I'll give you a couple of examples on that. Most of the people I see are very senior people. They're a rare cadre, the top 1% of an organization. But there's a lot of potential in organizations that don't really get access to training and development. I think what everyone's craving today, certainly the younger leaders I speak to, everyone's craving it is a sense of a pathway, a sense of a route, a sense of where you're going. And organizations aren't so good at that nowadays. I think they used to be in the past when people stayed with a firm for, 15 or 20 years or their whole career. But people are looking for a pathway, and that pathway has got lots of zigs and zags and turns and squiggles in it. So I think people need more development and more support, more mentoring, more trust, more opportunities to experiment, and more opportunities to second. And that needs managers to be really flexible about that, and to and to fight hard with your finance department and with your CEO or with your head of the business area or the function. Fight for those resources to keep people engaged in developing themselves along a pathway rather than just working in a job and being productive. And I think if you do that, I think you'll get more out of people. And I think you'll learn more as a manager and a leader by the feedback you get from those people on that path.
Thanks very much, John, for sharing your insights today. I'm going to let you go now, and we can both go back to our ChatGPT action figures. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
good.
again.
Just to say on glue, if I may, before
Of
we
course.
go, just say, people don't have to read the book. I understand from my publisher, nobody reads books anymore, which is hugely reassuring or worrying where you look. But if you check out Glue and you check out John Dore, there's a YouTube channel there, and we've produced 5 or 6 short videos, which are all these ideas around galvanize, listen, engage, and be unusual. And if you watch those little videos, it's 8 minutes of your time. I think you'll get more value from perhaps wading through the book.
Brilliant. Thank you so
Okay,
much,
pleasure.
John.
Lovely to speak to you. Thanks for your time, Farah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And thank
Thanks.
you to everyone for listening. You can subscribe on SoundCloud, on YouTube, or your preferred podcast provider to ensure that you don't miss an episode. Until next time.